Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Catherine Nordel, and I'm a member of the Trust Board of Trustees. I'm glad you're able to join us today for this webinar, Best Practices for Indigenous Clients, Indigenous Assessments and Methodologies for Mental Health and Wellness. This is part 4 of our Cultural Competency Forums. As we begin this forum, I wanted to note that there have been recent discussions on psychology listservs about some of the new administration's executive orders, particularly those directing the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and offices. Regardless of our political viewpoints about DEI initiatives, cultural competence is reflected in our ethics principles for psychologists. We at the Trust will continue to support the ethical practice of psychology, and specifically these cultural competency forums, to advance our core principles of competence and respect for people's rights and dignity. I am delighted to present to you today our webinar speakers, Dr. B.J. Boyd and Dr. Mark Standing Eagle Baez. Dr. Boyd is the current president of the Society of Indian Psychologists and is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology and has spent over 20 years working with tribal programs and communities as a direct care provider, healthcare administrator, grant writer, and community organizer. Dr. Baez is the president-elect of the Society of Indian Psychologists and is a Coahuiltecan member and a Mohawk and Pawnee people's descendant. He is a licensed psychologist with a small private practice. He has more than 16 years of experience in mental health and wellness and impactful research among Indigenous people across the lifespan has inspired significant change in the field of Indigenous mental health. I hope everyone learns a lot over the next hour and a half. And please join me in welcoming Dr. B.J. Boyd and Dr. Mark Standing Eagle Baez.
OCO, B.J. Boyd. As mentioned, I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation here in Oklahoma. I'm very glad to be here today. I want to talk a little bit to start off about just putting some context for what life is like in Indian country for people who are Indigenous. In the United States and Canada primarily, we'll be talking about North America, but I think you can take some of these lessons when you're talking about any Indigenous people, I would think. The challenge with doing this with psychologists is there's so much to cover. You know, if you're going to come work where I work, there'd be a lot of training if you weren't part of the culture already. And what do we focus on? And so trusting that you're all competent psychologists and can sort of fill in some of the gaps and do your own reading and things like that. I just want to give you sort of a context of where the people you may be working with when you work with Indigenous clients are coming from. So giving you some context of sort of how current Native people live and sort of what's shaping their perspectives that they may bring into working with a psychologist. So this is a little humor. This is the exit polls CNN did, not from the last election this past fall, but from the 2021. And as you can see, when they asked people their ethnicity, we fall into the something else category. It just so happened that about 2 weeks after that election, I was presenting as a alumni, the Native American alumni from my university, my alma mater. And so I said I was happy to be there as the distinguished something else of the year for that presentation. So we are a very statistically small part of the population. It can easily get overlooked, I think, when people think about demographics, diversity, inclusion, and cultural competency, not just in psychology, but any profession. If you look here, this is a Bureau of Indian Affairs map of the United States, how they've divided up their administrative regions. And I put this up there just because you can see they're kind of in Oklahoma, some places in the Southwest and Northern Plains where you can kind of maybe see some of the darker areas that show the concentration of where Native American tribes reside in terms of their reservations and their jurisdictional areas. It's a little harder to tell in Alaska, but Alaska actually has the largest number of they're I think more classified as villages, but of Indigenous entities. And if you look at that eastern region, it's hard to see because there are reservations in the eastern region, but they're just very small, so they don't really pop out on this map. And of course, we can't ignore Native Hawaiians. They are also indigenous people that are part of the, in the United States. And unfortunately, I don't have a similar map of Canada, but you can probably see similar pockets of concentration of where Native people are there. There are in the U.S. 574 federally recognized Indian tribes. We may be on the verge of 475, the Lumbee Nation. I think the Trump administration has indicated it will sign the approval of them being recognized. There are over 100 state recognized tribes. But there are also many other indigenous communities that lack any form of legal or formal recognition, who nonetheless have held on to their culture, their sense of ancestry, and their community in different ways, despite a lot of challenges, both in terms of sort of the acculturation pressures all indigenous people face, but also just state and federal recognition sort of give you some protections and some substance to kind of maintain your integrity as an organization or as a community. And it can be a little harder when when there's no legal standing to protect Native lands, Native artifacts, things like that. So just to let you know, kind of big picture, who Native people are, where they live, and we'll get a little more into that here. The thing I want to impress that is important, and this may sound more like a political science lecture to start off with, we'll get to the psychology shortly, but you can't really understand the psychology of indigenous people unless you understand indigenous sovereignty, whether we're recognized by the federal government as a sovereign people, or whether it's simply a Native community that exists still today. Respecting the sovereignty, the right of a Native community or a Native tribe to define who it is, what its values are, who their leaders are, how they come together to address community life, family life, culture, things like that. The right of indigenous people, their sovereign right to define themselves and to maintain their own culture and heritage, is really important. And there's some major contextual factors to consider, at least in the U.S., when you're talking about Indian country. Tribes are codified in federal law. Article 1 of the Constitution acknowledges the existence of tribal nations and gives them a legal status within federal law. And there have been numerous court rulings and federal acts that further reinforce the sovereignty of Indian tribes, particularly beginning in the 70s, coming out of the Civil Rights era. The Indian Self-Determination and Education Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Acts are three big ones that sort of helped as tribes started to sort of lose ground in terms of maintaining their just existence as tribal entities. Those were kind of really helpful in sort of reinforcing the ability of tribes to do that. But it all stems back to Article 1 of the Constitution. The other thing that is very important to remember is that relationships are the capital of Indian country. And I've said this my whole career, trying to help other people figure out how to work with tribal communities, maybe on an organizational level, but relationships are important. Or even if you're just a person who lives or works with an Indian community as just a direct healthcare provider or service provider, relationships become very important. You have to have a good reputation. People will get to know you, and they'll get to know, all right, this person may not be a tribal member, but there's someone we can trust. There's someone we can trust our family members to send to, trust we can go to for help. You have to have that relationship, which is a little odd sometimes for psychologists, because so much of our training is about maintaining boundaries and not, trying to avoid, if we can, dual relationships sometimes. But in Indian country, knowing people in the community way is the beginning of how you actually are able to be there and be accepted and actually have people trust you. So it can be a little challenging sometimes to the way we traditionally think of in Western psychology, our role or our place in that relationship. Tribal culture encompasses both the traditional and the contemporary. Sometimes the only window non-natives get into our world is talking about our history, our traditions, what happened long ago, our historical figures, our traditional arts, our traditional crafts, things like that, which is still important. but sometimes it's expensive looking at how Indigenous people live now in the modern world, how they hold on to those traditions, honor them, and continue to practice them, but also how they're part of the contemporary world. I mean, we have computers and cell phones and modern stuff. We enjoy movies and television and music and things like that, just like anyone else. And to not think of us as being completely separate from the rest of the world or the larger overarching culture would be a mistake. But embedded in that is one way that I say that you can think of how a lot of Indigenous people hold on to their culture. It's a culture of we, not me. So for all human beings, the psychology of an individual is tied to the culture and the history of their family, their community, the place they grow up, the place they come from. But for Indigenous people, you can also add into that our tribal culture, both traditional and contemporary. And for many contemporary tribal people, that also includes political engagement with our tribal government, who sits on our tribal council, who's the chief or the chairman, who are our community leaders. That there's a local politics aspect of that is part of being engaged with the community. We are talking about a very kind of a collectivistic culture as opposed to an individualistic culture. So again, a culture of we, not me. And so I think there's been a lot of discussion about the paradox of tolerance in the last several years. And I think at some point someone arrived at the understanding that, maybe better thinking of tolerance as a social contract. It's only for the people who agree to abide by the principle of tolerance. That's a whole other discussion for us, but there's really no paradox for us, I think. So we are kind of taught to tolerate everybody who's living peacefully with their neighbors. It doesn't matter whether we understand them or not. If they're not hurting anybody, if they're not causing harm to the community, there's no question that, well, then they're still part of the community. When you start to view everybody as family, extended kinship, as you'll see in tribal communities, we have to. It's imperative for us to love and accept and tolerate everybody around us, as long as they are not actively harming people. So what you'll see is some of the implications of that, as I mentioned, broader kinship networks, more collective approaches to child rearing. Some of the challenges we've had, say, dealing with child welfare in Indian communities is, they'll say, well, this kid is, parents are not able to take care of them, and they're hopping couches between their grandfather and their aunt and their second cousin. That's not healthy. Well, for our communities, that is exactly how you take care of a child whose parents are not capable of caring for them. Maybe one person can't take them in and just be their sole caregiver, but it's very natural for us, for not only grandparents, but aunts and uncles and older siblings and cousins, to take part in looking out for kids. But from a Western perspective, that looks that looks inappropriate, and they'll yank the child out and want to put them in foster care. There's more of an equity or sharing mindset. And I'll give you another example in a minute about sort of our kind of views on property. Anything you can kind of hold in your hand might be really yours, or your clothes. But as far as like land, property, other kinds of community resources, those are all kind of shared, and you're seen as a steward of that, not an owner of it. So there's a real focus, I think, on stewardship. They're more egalitarian principles, even though in some tribal cultures you will see certainly gender roles and division of gender roles for men and women. But even when you see distinct gender roles, the power hierarchy between men and women isn't quite as sharp as you might often see in other cultures. So it's maybe different roles, but one is not necessarily always placed over the other. Women tend to, in a lot of Native American cultures, hold a lot of social power. Many of our tribes are matriarchal in the way our societies are structured. And so women hold a lot of influence, even if they're not politically speaking the chief or the appointed spokesperson, say, for a community. It doesn't mean that the women in that community don't hold a lot of influence. And then different perspectives as you get broader. Just something else to know is we have kind of different perspectives on time and causality. So the way I live today can be seen as a benefit to the ancestors that preceded me in time. Certainly we think of what we do today having an effect on our children, our grandchildren, and their descendants, but for a lot of Native people, thinking about not just honoring our ancestors, but we actually do good for our ancestors in a time moving backwards and forwards, or in bidirectionality. And a lot of what Western people would see as sort of circular notions of causality, I think are not seen as illogical or nonsensical in a lot of Native cultures. The thing is, these are often unspoken, and they really exist without distinction. They become part of your implicit way of understanding the world around you. There may be pre-conscious. And so when you're talking with someone who comes from this worldview, and you come from a completely different worldview, you may be using the same words, but you're not really understanding each other. And we see this in Oklahoma, where we've had a lot of acculturation pressures over the years, where part of our solution for some of the tribes that were removed from the Southeast was for our cultures to just kind of fade into the background. So on the outside, we may look and dress like, any other American people. This is not just now. This is like going back for the last 100, 150 years. But our cultures are still there in the background. We're just not putting them out there. And that's a way of preserving them in the face of acculturation. But they're still there in those subtle, implicit ways, in the way we relate to one another, the way we look out for one another, the way we ask questions, the way we answer questions, the way we communicate. It's still there. It's just subtle, implicit, kind of in the background. And of course, just to share for my own life, there are things I was raised to do, ways I was raised to see things or think about things. But my family never said this is the Cherokee way of doing things. This is just the way we do things. And it wasn't really till I was an adult and got away from home and in college and grad school that it really kind of started sinking in. Oh, these ways that I seem to be very different from everybody else around me, that's a cultural thing, because it was never made, labeled with a distinct label of this is Cherokee or this is Native. It was just kind of the way we did things. This is an interesting, and this, I can share if anybody wants the link to the article I read where I pulled this from. But it's very interesting, and just an example that it turns out Maslow spent about 6 weeks living, or I think he went to do some field work among the Blackfeet, and he was, as I read the study this came from, he was trying to look at, again, how so this self-actualization process might play out in different cultures. And kind of what he observed, though, was that his question was how you're born, and then how do you, over the course of growing up towards adulthood or on into adulthood, try to hit this point of self-actualization, of being kind of who you are, and we have all these needs that we have to sort of satisfy first. But from the Blackfeet perspective, you're already there when you're born. You were born into that. It's not that you have to achieve something akin to self-actualization. You're there, but now you have an obligation to do something with it. How do you continue to preserve that? You have an obligation to stay there and to keep yourself in a healthy way, with a good mind, a good spirit, to be a good relative to your family, to your neighbors, to your community. And I guess from that perspective, then you knock one of these. How do you knock somebody off that or get them off of that track, where you would threaten some of these things in the hierarchy, right? So an alternate example here on the right, it would be that from a First Nations perspective is that if you're self-actualized as an individual, that leads to a sort of collective community sort of actualization for a healthy community, and it helps perpetuate the culture. And again, we can get into individuality versus collectivism and even concepts of time and causality if we do that. I think it's interesting here. There's a footnote in the article that Maslow himself never really used a pyramid. He just had a hierarchy. And that the native scholars who put this together point out that this concept, even in Blackfoot culture, is never, the teepee is never used as a metaphor for it, but they visually put it here just to note, not to over generalize that. But it did make me think of again, thinking of just shifting and looking at things from different perspectives. We tend to look at a teepee or a lodge in this sort of pyramid-like shape. But what it actually is a circle, and the lodge poles arranged around a circle define the lodge, and then it's they lean on each other, they support one another, which sort of creates the entire structure. So even though we might look at it from this perspective as a triangle, what it really is a circle, and it very much represents, I think, is a good metaphor for how Native communities operate in a very circular, holistic kind of way. Which leads me to this quote by Stan Rushworth, who's a Cherokee elder and author. The difference between a Western settler mindset is I have rights, and the Indigenous mindset is I have an obligation. Instead of thinking that I'm born with rights, I choose to think I was born with obligations to serve the past, the present, the future, the planet. But I think understanding the idea of being born with inherent rights versus being born with inherent obligations can tell you a lot about how Indigenous people sort of think, how they're raised, how they function, and how they see their role and their obligations to other people as it's an inherent thing. And the first thing when in time of crisis we check for is what are my obligations here? If I'm upset, if I'm feeling like there's a problem that I've got to solve, my thing too is not my rights have been violated. It's before I handle this and try to take care of myself, what obligations are important that I be mindful of right now. Another story I can tell you is an anecdote related to me by a friend in grad school was looking at elementary school kids in a small, mostly Native community in Oklahoma. And these two kids had gotten in trouble for cheating on their test. Well, they weren't cheating. One of them's pencil lead broke. And he said, hey, my pencil lead broke. So his kid sitting next to him was like, well, here. And they were passing the pencil back and forth just to answer the question. They weren't really looking at each other's papers. But the Western mindset is to see that, oh, look, that must be cheating. They're up to something. Well, no, they're just sharing a resource because one person had enough for both of them and one person was without. Another example, again, from that article I mentioned before with talking about the Blackfeet was particularly, I think it's some of the Plains tribes, your wealth is seen as what you can give away, how generous you could be. And so when you've had a good year, traditionally, whether it's hunting or everything you've gathered, at the end of the year, you distribute it to the people who don't have as much. A wealthy man is a person who I say man, a wealthy person is someone who has given everything they have to the community. And then they're respected and honored because of that, not because they demanded respect or because they made a spectacle of themselves, but because they gave to the people who needed. So what knocks that? What interferes with all that for us? Well, colonialism, and I've said colonialism is a shapeshifter. It's come in many different forms, from attempts by European settlers to coexist, to assimilate us into their culture, to remove us and just get us out of sight, out of mind, and then including armed conflict and things like over the course of history. So we think we've sort of defeated it in one form, and it comes back as something else over and over and over again. Colonialism remains an existential threat, really, to Indigenous communities and to our cultures. So some of the more contemporary ways it persists today. So again, it's changed shapes. And if any of you are familiar with Native folklore, Native stories, we have a lot of stories about shapeshifters. A lot of our monsters and scary things in the night are shapeshifters. So contemporary colonialism persists in a mostly subtle ways at this way. It's gotten very subtle. So removal of our children under the pretense that our families can't take care of them, and then adopting them to non-native families who now we've lost a child who's not present to carry on our culture into the future. Missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. So we have high rates, particularly of women in Indian country, missing and murdered people. And there's a lot of reasons that go into that. It could be a whole other presentation, but it is not just because we're poor or live in poorer parts of there's other forces at work that cause that rate to be higher than you would expect, even given the economic and geographical factors. Continued pressure for acculturation, to just put food on the table and a roof over your head and take care of your children. We have to interface with the outside world, right? Ethnic fraud. This is a big one we've talked about in SIP over the years amongst ourselves of how to deal with. It's people who claim to be Indigenous who aren't. And I guess it's one thing to maybe wonder if you have Indigenous ancestors or think you do, and to kind of explore and learn about our cultures, our histories, just for your own knowledge. It's another thing to then stand up in front of a group of people and say, I'm Indigenous and here's my opinion on this issue facing Indian country, whether it's tribal sovereignty or cultural preservation, language, tribal politics, sports mascots, whatever, big issues, small issues. People speaking on behalf of us when they have no legitimate claim to do so. And people have gotten like tenure track faculty positions. They've gotten grant money, and then they're not a member of any of our communities. Don't represent us. And then we have political threats. Always, we've got they're always, we do have sort of the backing of for the federally recognized tribes anyway, some federal protections that are there, but it's always a little tenuous. Supreme Court rulings can be reversed. Legislative acts can be, replaced. And particularly as tribes move into an era where some tribes anyway are experiencing some economic prosperity for various reasons, people want to cut of that. So if you can undermine, say, the Indian Child Welfare Act and chip away at tribal sovereignty, well, that sets a precedent for how now we can put a pipeline through native land, or get drilling rights in what should be the tribe's land, things like that. So we do face constant political threats through legal actions and things like that we kind of have to be on guard for. That you're going, what does that have to do with the individual psychology? Well, this is what a lot of Native people stress out about when they think about their families and their communities and holding on to their culture. These are the threats to me having a sense of my heritage. It kind of summed up pretty well in this is a quote from Henry Dawes, who was a Massachusetts senator who headed the commission that oversaw the allotment of land in Oklahoma. And after touring the Cherokee Nation, he reported back, the head chief told us there was not a family in the whole nation that had not a home of its own. There was not a pauper. The nation did not owe $1. It built its own capital, its own schools, its own hospitals. Yet the defect in the system is apparent. I mean, how much time do we spend in the United States debating how to get health care to people, how to educate our children, how to take care of, how to deal with poverty? And of course, the rest of the quote, as he goes on, I won't say the full quote, is he said the problem is they're not competitive with one another. Instead of, they're taking care of each other instead of competing with one another. And that sense of wanting to be better than your neighbor has stalled their advancement. Their civilization is stalled out. So that was the idea, that the justification for the allotment in Oklahoma, which had a lot of devastating effects on tribes' ability to self-govern and hold on to language and culture. And there are other, that's just Oklahoma. You can find it all over Indian country, similar stories of things like that. So how does this get into our practice as psychologists? And Mark will talk a lot more about some of this, but I want to kind of give a few things to think about. We need to practice cultural humility. And this is true of me even as a Cherokee person. When I work with someone who's not Cherokee, I have to practice cultural humility. When I work with someone of any other culture, when I work with people who have similar backgrounds of me, a little bit of humility goes a long way as a psychologist, because we don't want to assume we know anything about the person without kind of hearing their story of who they are, where they're from, what life is like for them, trying to see the world through their eyes, which I think we know that as psychologists. But when we're talking about someone from a different culture, I think that becomes even more important, that we have some respect and humility. Without doing that, we run the risk of a lot of things. We might overlook cultural differences in presentation of the meaning we ascribe to the signs and symptoms when we're trying to make a diagnosis or form a case conceptualization. There was a time several years ago where I worked, not where I work now, and we had one psychiatrist, and then that person moved on to another position. And so we had about a year where we were going through temporary, locums, and one guy who was there maybe didn't work out, but a client, I had to go to every psychiatrist every time and say, look, this guy does not have schizophrenia. But you're going to spend 10 minutes with him and you're going to think he has schizophrenia. He does not have schizophrenia, and try to explain some of his cultural ways of thinking and making sense of the world that might look to someone who didn't know a little bit like, a little maybe kind of loose associations, maybe some magical thinking or stuff. And this is just he just has a very native way of sort of his sort of understanding of causality, and his even way of sort of trying to explain what's on his mind, talking in very circular ways. Might be hard to follow if you're not used to listen to a more traditional native person speak. But I mean, for a year, 4 or 5, and maybe not 5, I think 3 or 4 different psychiatrists, I had to go and say, look, we teach our children more traditionally to listen, to not speak until they've gathered their thoughts and know exactly what they want to say. If you've got a teacher who demands that a child look them in the eye and answer immediately, particularly when they're in trouble, or they've made a mistake and they're being corrected, is that can be seen either as a sign of disrespect. I've seen it labeled as, is this kid on the spectrum when they aren't? Are they intellectually disabled? So we can get an inaccurate, case conceptualization, inaccurate misdiagnoses. We can certainly, as psychologists, misinterpret test results if we don't know what we're looking for. And this is kind of a thing, I know Mark and I and some other of our colleagues have talked about this, and I don't know if we have a definitive answer. We still kind of are bound to use things like the MMPI, the Wechsler, those tests. Sometimes it's just to get someone benefits or enrolled in a program, particularly kids with special education needs. We're kind of stuck with certain tests, but they don't always, the results might mean something different when you look at it through a cultural lens. An example I can give is I see a lot of Native children, when I say give the vocabulary on the Wechsler, I can tell they know what the word means, but the answers they're giving don't fit neatly into some of the gel with kind of the way we're taught to score it, because they're kind of talking around the answer instead of just giving the answer, if that makes any sense. So those are some of the real implications we have as psychologists when we don't practice that humility. We don't kind of learn how the other person is thinking from their background. One thing I didn't want to mention, I inadvertently skipped over that probably also has implications for clinical practice now, given kind of where we are in the U.S. is I mentioned sort of gender roles being more egalitarian, even if they're different in tribal cultures. But some native cultures you have concepts that encompass gender fluidity, or people who are non-binary, who are transgendered, or who are open to different sexual orientations. That's another one of those things that, depending on what part of the country you're in, you might not know, because it had to hide that along with other parts of culture to survive in the face of sort of Western, acculturation. And so to the point that, people say, well, where were all the gay Indians 100 years ago? It's like, well, they were hiding just like all the gay white people were. But so a lot of indigenous cultures do have sort of very different notions of fluidity or what is and isn't masculine, female, or how fixed those things are. And again, it comes down to, hey, this person is a little different than most of us in some way. That's not how most of us are, but that's one of our relatives. They don't bother anybody. And that's how they are. Fine. There's still a place for them in the community, still a place for them in the family. And so you may see that if you're working with native families too, that there's a sort of imperative to hold on to relatives, even when they're not always they don't always fit the mold, which I think for the most part we usually see as a good thing even in psychology, but it can become difficult sometimes when culturally you might have different notions of, well, where are those boundaries within a family? At what point is this family enmeshed versus this just a different cultural expression of how families function, right? I think there'll probably be more time for questions at the end, and I want to make sure Mark has time to get through some stuff he's got to present because it's really good. So I will wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Vlado, for having me today.
Sego, everyone. My name is Mark Standing Eagle Baez. One of the things that I just wanted to start off with, as BJ has mentioned, is in hopes that this presentation is an introduction to a culturally responsive method of mental health for us as practitioners. However, that it's not designed to train Western-based approaches or Western therapeutic modalities. Instead, it invites this audience regardless. Okay, these are a couple of things, again, that I'm going to be going over, and I'm just going to quickly try to catch up, but I wanted to just point out that this opportunity that I have is not to look specifically at Western-based approaches or Western therapeutic modalities, instead to have us as individuals, as practitioners, to consider our roles as professionals in supporting Indigenous clients and identifying missed opportunities or even opportunities for healing. When we see this right here, historical trauma, I may be preaching to the choir, but even the choir needs to be inspired every once in a while. Even if we've attended many of these presentations, historical trauma has impacted our communities. It definitely has impacted our health, as well as our well-being, and being able to recognize trauma of Indigenous peoples, which may be caring and or rethinking how we as professionals and our practitioners look at and place value on recovery from mental health when working with Indigenous clients. Historical trauma stemming from centuries of colonization, forced removal from land. When we're looking at some of these factors that factor in poor mental health, is something essential to keep in mind when working with Indigenous clients. I'm going to see if I can move this bar up here. Some of the gaps in care that BJ was referring to towards the end of his slides are some of the things that I wanted to highlight that may help us be individuals to promote wellness among our people. Discrimination, lack of diversity in mental health providers, lack of cultural responsive clinicians. When speaking about discrimination and looking at how this comes about, studies have shown that people of color more than often receive lower quality mental health care than white people. And in the U.S., American Indian and Alaska Natives are more likely than white people to report discrimination in healthcare. And they're showing that there's about 23% of American Indian Alaska Native report experiencing discrimination in clinical environments and or encounters. The lack of diversity, again, research, we look at how it provides us information when people that are of the same race or ethnicity as their provider, they're more likely to stay engaged in treatment and seeking more support and health from that provider. However, racial and ethnic populations only represent 1/6 of psychologists. And even though these communities represent closer to 40% of the United States population, just even having someone that looks like us lends to those individuals seeking health and well-being. Lack of cultural responsive clinicians. It's not to say that I'm referring to cultural sensitivity. I'm being sensitive to someone's culture, but truly understanding what is my responsibility to provide services that are cultural. We could say, this is what I'm doing, this is how I was trained, and if it's not working, it's them and it's not me. BJ had spoken about cultural humility and how it factors in how we can truly be the best that we can be in providing what we need to for our clients in need. So making a cultural connection across mental health services, looking at this should give us really good steps and or ingredients for making those important steps. Engaging with diverse communities and even learning about the cultural practices is essential. Also actively listening to patients' experiences and being open to learning about different cultures and to seek patient feedback is also essential. At least having that understanding of what I am hearing, what would be okay to ask, and how we can continue to build this meaningful relationship, with which I'll be speaking about in a few minutes. Also, being culturally responsive, again, as I mentioned, by acknowledging cultural norms and challenging stigmas, considering historical traumas, and recognizing socioeconomic disparities, also responding responsibly and culturally. So the cultural framework and approach to working with our people as practitioners, right? We know strength-based approaches work best for healing for us. So we have more opportunities for successful outcomes when we look at frameworks from a cultural context or lens. The vital work of Indigenous research, maybe even some that are joining us here on this Zoom today, is impacting our people's healing. And so when we look at the concept of our stories as evidence, our ceremonies as evidence, our Indigenous ways of knowing as evidence, they match just as valuable as Western-based practices. Thus, for the past 15 years as a practitioner myself, I saw the value in our people's healing in mental health. So I developed something to be more proactive than reactive. This is a framework, the Sweetgrass Method that I developed. And the Sweetgrass Method, you'll see like any grass, we use this particular sweetgrass that's grown for healing, for smudging, for grounding, for ceremonial purposes. And the grass that's harvested, it's braided. Well, this braid, it looks at these three main areas of the introspection, which is ourself as the clinician, our constant self-reflection and how we can learn, how we can do better, how can we incorporate what we do not know, the cultural humility, and also how do we weave the best of Western and Indigenous methodologies. That's the first braid, or excuse me, the first strand in the braid. And if you notice on the bottom right-hand you'll see a braid of the grass. Even within a strand, there's many strands. So everybody has their approaches and their understandings. So it's not just one way. The concept of the Sweetgrass Method is to divide the sweetgrass into 3 sections, as I mentioned, each of which is central to the strand. And you'll see the communication and the continuation. But the 3 central strands have many strands within each of the central strands. So your approach may not just have one approach. The way you communicate may have different approaches in communicating. And continuing our services may not just be one way, and maybe several different ways. So as we weave and braid tightly together to represent the strength of our intentions set forth, we're hoping that it allows us as practitioners to address social barriers that causes disparities in client success. So as a blade of grass is flexible, once it's stepped on, eventually it will bend right back. And I also use this sweetgrass as an understanding that we too, as practitioners, need to be just as flexible. It's not a cookie cutter approach. Every client is different, and yet we, as practitioners, need to be just as flexible to provide that understanding for the clients that we are serving. So when we're thinking of the Sweetgrass Method, I wanted just to share with you the importance of our Western approaches and how we will see the scientific rigor, theoretical, analytical, empirical evidence, individualistic, as well as self-reflection. But it's important that that's not the only strand, or that's not the only way. Which they're all important, but this is not the only strand. And another is the Indigenous strand, woven in as Indigenous practice-based evidence that looks at respect, right? It looks at understanding, it looks at relevance, it looks at community, wisdom, humility, and self-reflection. The third strand in the braid would be the client that you're working with. And how we would tailor those services to those clients that we are working with. Just like any relationship, we need to know steps before we actually begin this relationship. So even before we begin the Sweetgrass approach or method, it's imperative that we educate ourselves to learn about the history of the particular individual. As BJ had mentioned earlier, there's not just one tribe. There's not just one way of conducting ceremonies and rites of Indigenous peoples in your particular area that you are serving. So educate yourself. Also, build trust. Approaching Indigenous communities respectfully and openly. Establishing trust is essential, right, for meaningful relationships. Lay out your intentions. There's no secrets. There's no hidden agenda. Again, there's been a history of distrust. So please keep that in mind, that we come to provide as much as we can when we can, but it's important that we build these relationships, meaningful relationships with those that we are serving. The last step is engaging respectfully, right? Initiate conversations with Indigenous individuals and groups. Also ensure you listen actively and value their point. Building a relationship requires multiple respect of understanding. It's not just my way or the highway. It takes two to weave in these steps of building a relationship. So seek introductions through trusted community members, something that I did. I'm Native American. I'm a psychologist. I was asked to go work with the tribe I've never worked with before. And the response was, you're Indian, you're a psychologist, go work with the people. Contrary to popular belief, upon arriving on the reservation, I was seen as an outsider. Even at some time where I had to prove not only that I was there for for this connection and the building of relationships, but to help, and not just to take it as a way of, I know better, I'm a doctor, and I'm here to bring some magic medicine. It's more of, what can I do to share my story and who I am and where I come from, where we would have an understanding in building that relationship and moving forward. Its applicability with the Sweetgrass Method in mental health. There are many research-based mental health prevention and intervention programs. I know everybody on this Zoom has many different methodologies. However, there's little research available to inform our understanding as mental health practitioners within Indigenous contexts. Its consequences among Indigenous people, right? And what prevention approaches are culturally aligned with our people, with Indigenous people. However, for professionals working with Indigenous people, any framework, I think, to prevent and address mental health must consider cultural contexts as a critical component of addressing specific issues, right? So the Western approach, again, is only one perspective on mental health services among Indigenous populations. And incorporating traditional Indigenous methodologies is crucial to effectively addressing the mental health needs of marginalized Indigenous communities. So if we can think of the one strand of Western methodologies that you know that are working and incorporate Indigenous ways to weave together those for the client and or community that you are servicing, would be more impactful, and you would see greater results. So as I'd mentioned, some of the Indigenous approaches, some areas often struggle with this because what we have as practitioners, we're immersed with Western knowledge, which is predominantly in most of our approaches. As BJ had mentioned, using instruments, I'm using all Western-based instruments that are evidence-based. However, I weave in practice-based evidence, what works for the communities, by indigenizing some of those approaches that I am using. So this typically refers to a dominant, as I had mentioned, with Western only, a dominant perspective in the field that emphasizes individualistic cognitive behavioral interventions, often rooted in theories and practices developed primarily within Western cultures, right? And this perspective potentially overlooks the unique needs and cultural contexts of Indigenous populations, particularly when it comes to addressing mental health challenges. So I think by weaving in the Sweetgrass Method of the best of Western evidence-based practices and Indigenous practice-based evidence for our clients, we tend to approach this in a way where we can weave all of the best for the clients that we are serving. So with that, I want to say Niawin Nalatsam, thank you for your time. And I hope to answer any of the questions that you have.
Trying to get my video turned back on. I have technological challenges as well. I want to thank both of you for the very informative presentations you gave. And I will let you know I'm feeling very humble at this point in time with not much, certainly not much expertise. We have a number of questions, but I wanted to kick off one, and I'm not trying to put anybody in any crosshairs, but I know that the APA Ethics Code is under revision. And I know that, or I understand that some member or members of the Indigenous community are on that code revision panel. I also am very aware, although do not have a lot of personal knowledge about it, that your Society of Indian Psychology, there was a commentary on the last iteration of the ethics code. And so I was wondering if there are, to help me and help some others understand. I know, BJ, you mentioned earlier this area of dual relationships and how they may be seen different, the boundaries between therapist and client. Are there some, can you, either of you, give us some simple kind of concrete examples where there may be some divergence on a particular issue in the ethics code and the SIP interpretation or commentary on that, other than maybe dual relationships? I'm trying to think where those might be. And like I said, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know you guys, your society's been very involved with that, and was curious where you see some real headbanging actually in the ethics code.
I would encourage everyone to visit our website. You can get in contact with me through our website if you would like to look at the commentary.
Yeah.
There's a way to contact me to get a copy of the commentary. And then when you give your own feedback on the current proposed, see if APA listened. See if they took any of our suggestions to in with. We do have a couple of I think they're both members of the society who are on the committee currently, but that's two people's voices with a large group. So even with people trying to listen to them, you never know how things shake out once everybody votes on what goes in and what goes out. But and Mark may have something to add to this, but I without going back and looking through the commentary in detail, it's been a while. I think so. We got a lot of. You'd be surprised at how much of the commentary, the comments we get are not always about practice. They're about the way our students and our colleagues are treated by peers in training or in the workplace. I mentioned that sense of family. It's not uncommon. It's not been an uncommon story for like one of our members to say, this woman died back home, and I was expected because of familial obligations to come spend a week or so with the family. But trying to explain to the chair of my department, this is my uncle's second wife. We're not a blood relative, but this is still my auntie. You work in a Western business place that, yeah, you can take the day off to go to the funeral, but you got to be back on Monday, right? That's still the model that just goes, with a student, does that mean I get an extension on assignments? Do I get, time to grieve? And people don't get it. Or, even faculty members need to take a sabbatical for stuff like that, because of cultural stuff can be. I think with in terms of clinical practice, I know for me, and to APA's credit, this has gotten better with each iteration, but I remember looking at the APA Code of Ethics and when I was a grad student going, oh my gosh, I could never go back to my hometown as a psychologist. I've been bumping into people at the gas station and the grocery store. I can't go to church with people that I might be clients. I mean, it was really, it's gotten a little better at defining what is and isn't just bad, but it's that kind of around. And now imagine the idea that I'm supposed to go into a sweat lodge with a client, with stripped to the waist in this little, sauna-like hut and talk about deeply spiritual meaning, not like just psychological, emotional stuff, but deeply spiritual, religious stuff. But there are places where that might be seen as okay. I want my therapist here as part of this. Mm-hmm. They're important to me. They're one of the people who are helping me heal. Why would they not come to a community gathering where I'm going to be? Mm-hmm. Also, that serves to separate the Indigenous psychologists from our perspective, from our ability to connect to our culture, because you're telling us we shouldn't be engaged in stuff with our clients. But our clients are our community. They are maybe not our first degree blood relatives, but they are in a way when we're practicing in our home communities. It's extended kinship. And so navigating that, knowing that people are going to, I've had this happen. I don't work as close to home as I used to, but I've had this happen. People call me because I grew up with them, mm-hmm. but then they want me to be the psychologist for their family. And I'm like, You have to, how close do we know each other? How well do we know each other? Because the reality is sometimes you're the only psychologist. You're the only one with the skill set. If you're not the only psychologist, you're one of the few, and you're the one that has that sort of, you deal with that issue, or you're the one who's works most with kids or with elders or something like that. So.
Yeah, lots of issues. Mark, did you have something you wanted to add to
Yeah.
that?
Yes, I was just thinking, just working here at the university, we've had several students that have had or needed time for burial, and some of the professors not understanding. Okay, you have this day or 2 days. Make sure you come back ABC. But some are of our ways have of ceremonies of 4 to 5 days, and the lack of flexibility for some, or the lack of understanding, is pretty difficult. Where some students would even share, "I'm afraid to say someone else passed away in my family," because it seems like it's more of a burden to say you're off too many days, or even if I need to go see a medicine person, it's not for 50 minutes in someone's office. I have to travel, and it may take a couple of days in coming back. So the lack of sensitivity or flexibility for the overall grounding or foundation seems to be severed when there is no understanding or lack of, or even trying to get to understand, to know, to be flexible, to work with. It's cut and dry. We follow the Western clock, which is important. We follow on this time, but as Indigenous people, what is more important is not the time. If I come in 5 or 10 minutes late, what's essential is our relationship. Are we connecting? Are we able to respect one another, to build a meaningful relationship? But on our end, we're like, "You're late. You are late." That's what's important for me, is the time. And for us, it's more about our opportunity to build a relationship.
Thank you. So I have a
I would
couple
just say,
questions.
I'm working now in a tribal mental health program. That's not the rule. If the client shows up 45 minutes late, they get 5 minutes of therapy. We're
Good
here for
old
them.
West.
Whatever capacity they can come in and try, we are here for them.
Mm.
And of course, it'd be a lot harder to do in like private practice where you've just lost billing, I understand, but that is the impetus here, because we're able to do that because it's a tribal organization.
I've got a question from one of our participants. How would you recommend maintaining appropriate boundaries as a psychologist while also following cultural competence rooted in the importance of relationships for Indigenous peoples?
Mm. Well, what I would, and I have a license like most of us do, so we do have our guidelines, and what we need to do. And a lot of times where I feel like there's going to be a conflict, that I would verbalize that. I don't, again, no hidden agenda, and I am not going to be unethical, but I am there again to be the best clinician I can, whether it even may be I need to refer, that we can sit down and at least talk about it, and even working with family. And I'm just laughing over here because I'm trying to say, we don't counsel our own. What do you mean you don't counsel your own? You're related to them. How can you not be? This is your relative. So we're trying to at least have an opportunity to explain versus I can't. And at least having those opportunities to disseminate information, as well as with an alternative, seems to be something that has worked for the most part for myself.
I would echo what Mark said. I was just thinking of one of the worst nightmares for a psychologist to sit down on a plane and a stranger asks you what you do for a living. It's like, okay, they're going to pump me for free. On the other hand, we do have an obligation as psychologists to educate the public about our profession, what we do, what we have to offer. So as Mark said, just talking about that, but also not just leaving a person out cold, and say, look, there's some reasons that I can't, and I'll explain them to you, so you can understand that. But I'm not just going to say good luck with that. I will work to find what's the next best alternative to get you the help you need. I'll check on you until, you know, I know you've got a therapist or you've got the services you need, particularly if it's a kind of a crisis situation where the person may, of course, our boundaries get a little more permissible when it's life or death. But I think but Mark, I said it perfectly. You just talk about it. Because if, just like we don't want to leave our relatives out, our relatives don't want to make our lives harder. They'll reciprocate that.
Okay, thank you. What are some common challenges that non-Indigenous clinicians face when working with Indigenous clients? And how can they or we overcome these obstacles to provide effective and respectful care? So what do you think are some of the most common challenges that non-Indigenous psychologists would face in working with Indigenous clients?
I'll use some humor. My wife is not Native. She works in tribal communities just like I do. And she has said that you have to be prepared that Natives are the most passively non-compliant people. In that if you offer offense or insult, we don't push back. I mean, that really goes against a lot of the stereotypes as people who are warriors and brave. In peaceful society, we don't push back. We just nod, and then we just don't call you back. We don't show up for the next appointment. We don't. We're out the door and we don't come back. And so that's a lot of one of the things I think. Getting used to I use it as a way to introduce getting used to the more subtle types of communication that I think a lot of Native people will use with nonverbals, what they don't say, with different cultural. That's a big one. Different cultural expressions of assertiveness, directness, and that's where I've seen non-Native folks where I work struggle is when they can't sort of get into the flow with people. They need everything to be explicit and listed out. Where we're much more of you just kind of get in with the flow, and there's a lot of verbal and nonverbal, subtle, and there's a mix of that, and we can't just give you a how-to list.
I would add one of the big things that I've seen, even with colleagues throughout the United States, is educate yourself. Not to say that you have a lack of education, you're a psychologist or mental health practitioner, but educate yourself and learn as much as you can about that particular individual. Their tribe is huge, and it seems to be something that continues to be missed. Another thing is building the trust that there are no secrets. Again, you're an outsider. What do you want? I know you may be asking for something. I don't trust you. I have stories in the past of your type, or you people continue to lie. So building the trust, educate yourself, build its trust, and also engage respectfully. What I think would be essential is if you have seek introductions through a trusted community member. I had to do that. And what really helped me was I would always ask, who are the elders, to go visit with some of the elders, and those elders know everybody else. But at least if you have someone from that community to learn a little bit more of who to approach and who not to approach, what to say, what not to say. Sometimes in some tribal cultures, you speak with a husband first, and you don't go to. I'm like I always, hello, how are you doing? Trying to greet, where it'll be one way. It's some of the Navajo relatives. It's the other way around, where everything the buck stops with the grandma. So you have to get grandma's permission. So I have to educate myself so I don't get my hand slapped. But again, my ultimate goal is not a hidden agenda, but to work with the people. As much as I want to say to work with my people, non-Indigenous practitioners are, there's more non-Indigenous practitioners than there are Indigenous practitioners. So it behooves myself and BJ to share with you as much as we can, because we know that we can't be everywhere, but you can. And when you are, that we at least teach you those steps that you take and approach with respect and humility.
Thank you. Can each of you or one of you, one of our participants wanted to know more about generational trauma within indigenous, cultures, and how you would, what's an appropriate way to address that? Or does it come, I mean, is it something that needs to be like handled on the front end in terms of getting to know the individual, or what's the best way to address that issue from a non-Indigenous person's psychologist perspective?
We're seeing who's going to blink first, right? I would say, historical trauma is kind of for the individual psychologist working with a person, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because we want to understand that there's a historical factor in the community, the family, but it may not be what the person is. They may have a problem that not much really just strongly related to that. I mean, you want to know that about their kind of worldview, and it informs who they are, but it may not be, they might have a simple phobia that you just need to help them overcome, and probably the simplest example. But I think I would talk to the people about their culture. Talk to a client about, I just want to understand how kind of culture informs how you feel about yourself, what's important to you, what matters, what are the family stories or the things that stick with you. Because with historical trauma, there's a few things that may be going on. There's the generational transmission of whether it goes through epigenetics or learned behavior. You can see that pattern in sometimes in people where, but at the same time, it's try to think the best way to say this. We both talked about time, our orientation to time being very different. Can you imagine sort of the impact on the first generation of children born to, say, refugees versus the second generation, the third generation, the fourth, fifth, sixth, and on down? But when you exist in a cultural space where 7, maybe even more generations back are seen as sort of your immediate, this did not happen to my father and mother, this happened to my great-great-great-grandfather, but those people, even though I've never met them in this life, that's as important. That's a big deal. And the exact, I mean, we could probably debate among psychology the exact mechanism by which that takes place. But I know, when you grow up here in your whole life, we got screwed by the federal government or by it creates a certain, it just shapes it. And, different people that will make different meaning of that. Some people are like, yeah, unfortunately, that's the truth, and they'll try to move on. Some people, it sits with them and they stew on it. And it's like, because you can start to trace your problems of your family didn't have a lot of money. You didn't have a lot of opportunities, economically, socially, politically, that we need to make a living today. And you can show how my community has been held back because of the historical forces that can produce sorrow, grief. It can produce anger, outrage, anxiety, the whole gamut of things. I think the important thing to think about is historical trauma is not a DSM-5 diagnosis, but there are a lot of DSM-5 diagnoses that you can kind of attribute to historical traumas. And that's not just true of Indigenous people. I think you can see that in any population who's had to face that kind of adversity historically.
I would add just briefly, as practitioners, we know that it's a collective psychological injury, right, that has been passed down. But I'm hoping everyone in this Zoom is competent. We had to jump through some serious hoops to get where we are. Use what you have as a highly effective practitioner, the very best of Western-based evidence. But it's important that we weave that into the very best of Indigenous practice-based evidence. These are some really heavy questions that we will take that client, that Indigenous client, to some place where they may have never been before. So having that understanding of sensitivity, the cultural humility, the cultural responsiveness, that's going to come into play. With you having what you have, those instruments, and being a psychologist, you have that. It's just, how do I weave that in to be more culturally appropriate, as well as indigenize these steps to elevate that wellness for the Indigenous client?
Thank you. We've had some questions about suggestions for further reading, and I noticed, I think, Mark, you had, it looked like had been putting some links, I think, into the chat box for folks. But are there some readings or some sources of information that kind of rise to the top of your thinking that would be like a first read for non-Indigenous psychologists that are thinking about working with Indigenous persons or live in communities where there are a number of Indigenous persons, that would be good for them to read from a therapeutic and helping standpoint?
What I had in the box, and I'm trying to look at it, there was one, it's on hope. And that it's an acronym for honoring our people's experiences, and it's for non-native practitioners. Honor our people's experiences with intergenerational and generational trauma. How can we honor someone if we don't know anyone? Hey, read this paper. How do we take those first steps of building a meaningful relationship? Was really the motivative factor in writing that paper, because I have had so many colleagues, non-Indigenous practitioners, working with Indigenous practitioners and wanting to know, how do we take this first step in building this relationship to further the support for Indigenous populations? So, and I put it in the link.
Good. Anything, BJ, that comes to the top of your mind about additional reading or recommended reading?
Well, that's a tricky, because we have so many different tribes, and any individual person may have different degrees of acculturation and different sort of relationships with their own Indigenous heritage. It's hard to just pick one or two books. I think there's no, it's going to sound strange, there's no substitute for experience of just working with Native people and being patient, taking it slow, and trying to relate to them and kind of get to understand their perspectives. I think, Counseling the Culturally Different by Sue is a classic. It addresses more than Indigenous people, but it does sort of get you into the mindset of, how do I start thinking about working with someone from a different culture? I think that's a good one. And I found I've seen more insight as a psychologist really reading more like Native literature than books by other psychologists on that. So just Native authors, everything from like Vine Deloria or which is more political social commentary, to Native fiction that just it captures the experience of Native people. There's a one classic. It's called Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko. It's about I believe it's Pueblo is the character. He's a World War II veteran with PTSD. It doesn't really go anything through clinically, but it talks about his journey of healing traditionally, and it's just kind of a window. But anytime you can look at nonfiction, fiction, poetry, writings, essays by Native scholars, Native artists, Native authors, you get a further window into kind of the way, the experience of Native people in a way that's
I was going to say, I think one of the things that areas where we probably all need some work is the big difference between a Western way of thinking about individuals and individual rights versus more of an Indigenous way of thinking and community. When you mentioned it's the I have these rights, by gosh, versus I can't come into this world with commitments, with things that I need to honor. And those are two entirely different worldviews. And so I think there's a lot of educating that those of us raised, particularly with that Western culture, need to be finding out about ourselves if we're going to work in an appropriate manner with persons from an Indigenous culture and with other individuals that come from more Eastern types of thinking traditions than the Western tradition that we've had in this country.